Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to give everyone about a minute or so to join and get settled. As you're arriving, please go ahead to the chat and say hello. We'd love to know where you're from, where you're joining from, both your location and your school, organization, or company. It'd be great if just to see where everyone is from. Please throw that in the chat and make sure that everyone can see it. Great. Awesome. Well, we've got a sizable group, so I'm going to go ahead and get started because we have a full agenda for you today. So again, if you're just joining us, please share your location and entity you're calling in from. My name is Tristana Perkle, and I am the program manager for the School Garden Support Organization-Network, or SGSO-Network as we call it for short. Today, we're on the second webinar of our SGSO-Network Leadership Institute Promising Practices series, with the focus of finding, improving, and sequencing high quality garden education lessons. So to start, some housekeeping. This webinar and every webinar we do is recorded. If we could go to the next slide, please, that'd be great. Awesome, thanks. So you'll receive a link to the recording and the follow-up email, and all recordings are archived on the webinars page of our website. The link is right there. I'll be sharing a copy of the presentation in the chat. We'll share in just a bit, and that's especially helpful to download if you'd like access to any of the links. We will have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. As questions come up for you during the webinar, you can submit those questions via the Q&A section. Please use the Q&A section only, not the chat, specifically for questions, so that we can easily organize those. And you can see any asked questions, and we encourage you to upvote ones you'd also like to see asked. We'll compile those at the end and ask those of our panelists. And then finally, we will have a post survey. We'd love to know what you think about the webinar, so please submit your thoughts via the survey. It'll automatically pop up in your browser once the webinar ends, and there will also be a link in the follow-up email. Great, so our agenda today, I'll share a bit of an overview of the SGSO network for those of you who are new, including a summary of who's here today. Then we'll dive into everything all about finding and sequencing lessons. And then we'll leave 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. This webinar is an hour and 15 minutes, and the last 15 minutes will be the kind of the optional Q&A section. So if you got to go at the top of the hour, totally understand. Great. So at the SGSO Network, we're a learning community of school garden professionals. We seek to connect, build best practices, and provide easy ways for you, the school garden experts, to ask and share information. We have three main avenues of peer-to-peer opportunities. Webinars, such as the one we're on today, will provide a platform for SGSO leaders to share their expertise. In-person gatherings, including the Leadership Institute, the upcoming summit, as well as gatherings at other related conferences when we can do that again safely. And then our digital commons, which includes our website where we organize our newly renovated Promising Practices page. You'll learn all about that in just a bit, as well as our digital commons. So if you go to the next slide, that'll include a link to join either our email list or our Google forum, which is a great way to connect with the network and also get all of the information that you need. So go to that webpage to join. So who's here today? We have over 380 people signed up for just this particular webinar, representing folks from 47 US states, including Guam, and also other countries, including Taipei and Haiti. In terms of the types of organizations that you all represent, majority of you are nonprofits, but the next biggest group is schools and district entities. You also come from schools, universities, government entities, and coalitions. And together you support over 6,840 school gardens. So now I'm going to pass it off to Whitney Cohen of Life Lab, the amazing partner for the Leadership Institute, and so much more with the network. Thanks, Whitney.
Thank you, Tristana. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Whitney Cohen. I'm the Education Director at Life Lab, and just want to share with you what we've been up to in this last month. For the past 5 years, actually, we've hosted a National Leadership Institute for School Garden Support Organizations here in Santa Cruz. And this year, for obvious reasons, was our first time ever doing that virtually. And so as you look at this map, these are the folks from all across the country who gathered virtually in 4 different working groups over 1 week in February and then another week in March. And all of what we're going to share coming up here in this webinar comes out of the work that happened in this kind of thought partnership at the Institute this year. The Institute was hosted by LifeLab to bring SGSO leaders and practitioners together, and funded and supported in partnership with the Whole Kids Foundation. So coming out of the Institute, we had 4 working groups, as I mentioned, and those themes, each one focused on a theme, and those themes are listed on the bullets here. So we had a group focused on sustaining school gardens, our group that you're going to hear from today on finding and sequencing lessons. Then we also had a group focused on strengthening equity and inclusion in garden education, and one on program assessment. And so coming out of each of those working groups is a webinar. So obviously today you're on the one about lessons. There was one a week ago that's now archived on sustaining school gardens, and the other 2 are coming up in April. And also coming out of the Institute, we gathered many, many resources from SGSOs across the country, our own from the people who were represented in the working group, but also other SGSOs who submitted their resources to be shared. And we compiled those onto these promising practice websites. So you can see the website where all of these are housed at the bottom here, the Promising Practices website. And we're going to be diving in today into one specific web page from there, which is the lessons web page. So within the big institute, this was our finding and sequencing high quality lessons working group. So you can see, if you just kind of take a minute to look around this map, you'll see all of the folks who were engaged together in this working group. We gathered for a week in February, compiled resources, and those are what we'll be sharing with you today. All of the resources we share today can be found here at sgsonetwork.org/lessons. This is the website that showcases kind of all of the work that we compiled. And I want to highlight that this web page is a living web page. So we kind of gathered lots of things and sent out forms to the network and gathered lots of resources from what exists right now. But we know there's so much more out there. And if you're interested in contributing, if you're watching this, you're going, oh, I have another great resource about that topic, you're welcome to contribute it. And at the very bottom of this lessons webpage, you'll see this little footer, and it gives you a link to a form where you can contribute your own resources. So if somebody is sharing, lesson sequences and you go, hey, my organization has a great one of those, you are welcome to upload it there so that we can try to add it to our webpage. All right, I'm going to turn it over now to Erica Curry.
Thanks, Whitney. Hi, everybody. My name is Erica. I'm a consultant with Row by Row, and I also work with Food Corps. Excited to be here with you all today. And I was one of the co-facilitators of the work group at the Institute. We wanted to share a little bit about some of the things that you shared with us when you registered for the webinar. We asked a couple questions. We wanted to share the answers right now. One of the questions we asked you all was, what were the primary considerations that you think about when you're making a sequence? And there were pretty even responses. A couple things to point out. Seasons, of course, was a huge consideration for everyone that is a garden educator, along with the big picture of garden skills and tasks. Program goals, unit themes, and also thinking about standards and pacing guides also came up, kind of evenly spread within your answers. So we'll be touching on all of those topics today. Next slide, Whitney. We also asked, what do you wish you had known about lesson sequences? And we have a lovely word cloud here that highlights some of the answers that you all shared. Couple things, of course, lessons came up, but a couple things to point out was that standards really was what came up as one of the big topics that you all think about. We are going to be talking about standards in the presentation today. And of course, students was also one of the big ones. And we'll be touching on that as well, how students inform the sequence, what knowledge are they bringing, and also what can we learn from students thinking about their cultural food traditions and the context of the community when developing and leading a sequence and developing lessons. So those are some of the responses that you all shared with us. Thanks so much. That was helpful for us when we put together the webinar. All right, so how are we going to structure our time? Moving forward for the next hour or so, we are going to be thinking about 3 big scenarios. So our work group participants are going to take us through 3 scenarios, and each scenario is meant to provide really a taste of the webpage that we put together for you all as a result of our work during the Institute. The idea is that these tastes through these scenarios can help you navigate the information that's going to be included in the webpage, and for you to kind of get a sense of how to use the webpage and kind of bring it to life for you all. So we just want to highlight that we're doing 3 scenarios, and we're not going to go through everything in the webpage. We're going to have sort of a taste by guiding through these 3 scenarios, and that's really the purpose for you to get a feel. So the first scenario is parameters that inform your program planning and sequencing. And that will really cover thinking about how to plan a sequence when you're really thinking about what your North Star is. So what's really your broad guiding approach to developing a sequence, lesson sequence. The second scenario that we'll go through is developing lessons that align to standards and a district pacing guide. So that's thinking about why are standards important. We'll really touch on that topic too. The third and the last scenario is thinking about making a lesson more culturally responsive, and we'll share some tools, some definitions around culturally responsive sustaining education, and thinking about the pillars that you can use to guide you around this type of teaching practice when you're developing lessons and sequences. All right, now I'd like to introduce our first 2 presenters. These were folks that were involved in our work group at the Institute. I'd like to introduce Shay Scribner. Shay uses they, them pronouns and works at Oxbow Farm and Conservation Center, which offers on-farm programming and school partnerships. They are located in the Snoqualmie Valley in beautiful Western Washington. And a fun fact about Shay is that they share their home and life with 30+ animals from 8 different species, not including spiders and other wild friends. I'd also like to introduce Callan Duke. Callan uses she, her pronouns and works for Sustainable Nantucket in Nantucket, Massachusetts. Fun fact about Callan is that she lives in the forest in a house that is less than 160 square feet. So I'd like to hand it over to Shay and Callan.
Alrighty, good morning to those of you on the West Coast. My name again is Shay Scribner, and I'm sitting at Oxbow Farm right now. And yeah, we're just gonna jump right in to kind of a gentle welcome. Actually, we're not going too hard yet, but some ideas to share around finding your North Star as you start to plan a lesson and plan a sequence of lessons. So one of the wonderful things about garden education is it is so diverse. There's many different angles that you can approach this from that depend on your specific location, the time of year, the folks that you're working with. So we're going to kind of break down some of the ways that you can start approaching this work. If you do have a pencil and paper and want to take some notes about things that pop up that are relevant to you or questions or ideas you have, we're going to have time for some questions at the end. So we do welcome you to jot down some notes as we get going here. So if we could jump into that next slide, this is just a screenshot of our lessons, SGSO-Network.org/lessons web page, where you can find all of this information. Again, everything that we're sharing here today, there's so much more to it. Each of those little questions down at the bottom of the screen there is a clickable link that jumps into some examples and some more thoughts to help guide you as you start planning. All right, Callan, we can go ahead and go on the next slide. There we go. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Callan Duke from Nantucket, Mass. And let's dive in. So as Shay said, when you're considering sequencing lessons for your garden, once you've identified, when you look on the lessons webpage, there's a lot of work that happens ahead of time, like identifying your students' needs, things that are particular to them. And once you've done that, you're going to want to identify your time frame. So sometimes sequences are within seasons, like we have summer coming up. Maybe you're just doing your summer season, or maybe you're doing your whole school year. So I looked at this, I used the model of my school year in Nantucket. So I have about 9 months and I'm visual. So I drew it out And if you're doing this as we go, you might want to think about how works best for you to organize it. And I'm thinking about not only the length of time, but how much time I have with the students. So I'm lucky enough to have the 5th graders about once a week, the whole year. So that includes, I need to have planning for December, January, and February. And in Nantucket, gardening in those months is not an easy task. So I'm thinking about the whole year and how I need to plan. So think of your time frame first. All right, next, please. And then once you kind of have your time frame in mind, what you're planning it for, we need to identify all of the, we're calling them North Stars, right? All of the things that guide us. And in our lessons webpage, we've suggested just picking one and going with that. But the reality of garden education is that you do have so many factors influencing you. Those of you who responded to the survey identified those, right? You've got seasons, you've got garden skills, you've got unit themes, you've got community events and festivals, and then you have state standards oftentimes. And so here I've just kind of mapped out a few of the things in each category which influence me and how I plan my lesson sequence. And then I'll show you how I figure out what those all are and then kind of put them into the sequence. And next, please, next slide. Sometimes it's very natural and obvious where they go. And this could be by, next slide, by seasons, right? So there's some real obvious orders that things have to go in. Like in our garden, we have a ceremony where we close down the garden and we open up the garden. We have a very short growing season in Nantucket, but those are obvious times. I wouldn't put closing down the garden any other time besides November, and I wouldn't really open it too much sooner than April. And then obviously our harvest festival, right? That's lends itself to being in September or early October. So I plug those in. I know when those are going to be. Next, please. And then I think about skill acquisition. And sometimes the thing with skills, especially within the garden, sometimes they build upon each other. So it's not just when you want to do it in relation to the school year, but sometimes to teach one skill, the children need to have had some other pre-skills before they go on. So in this case, I've put teaching garden rules at the very beginning of the school year. Students returning need a refresher, brand new students need to know what they are. And then in October, when we're going to be harvesting, go back, please. We teach them about honorable harvest and how to use some very basic tools that they might use when they're harvesting. And then, of course, I'm teaching them skills throughout. I'm reinforcing the garden rules throughout. But then in March and April, we do a really heavy lesson on planting, using dibbles and measuring and all the different lessons that children can learn around planting. Of course, we could have taught that, in December when we have a lot of time on our hands, but then we'd have to reteach it anyway. So it really makes sense to do it in March or April when we're going to be planting. Next slide, please. And then our theme. Our students in grade 5 do less sort of abstract themes like you might do in pre-K, community helpers or weathers. They do service work and leadership are their big themes. And so in February, when we're not doing much planting, but they can still get in the garden, we do service work with the 5th graders, which is like building the beds up and getting rid of old pots and things that need to be out of the garden, but aren't going to disrupt anything that's going on in the garden, because again, that's not a really prolific time in our gardens in Nantucket. And then in March, we start a leadership garden mentors program where the children actually, this is a picture of our middle schoolers harvesting their lettuce that they planted, transplanted, grew, and then harvested. So obviously a lesson like that has an obvious sequence, right? You plant before you transplant, before you harvest. And that's a little bit of backward by design, which will be discussed later on. We knew that we wanted the lettuce for June. So we kind of worked back with the length of growth for lettuce, and we decided we had to start in April. So that kind of lent itself to the sequence that it had to be in. Next slide, please. So then at the end, and as you're going, truly, you need to review and reflect. So you might have this beautiful sequence, but then you check in with the teachers and maybe there's some conflict or time of year when there's not a lot going on and they want you to add something and you can rearrange it. And you'll notice in this one, I have all of the different elements that we talked about already put in there. And then I've added in November, December, the 2 standards that come up in 5th grade that are related to the garden, which are compare composter design and design a composter. And that's because I've checked in with the 5th grade teacher who tells me testing is in May. So we really need to get those standards honed in, understood, and reviewed again before May. So I put them early on in the year. I want to do compare the designs in November when they can be in the garden. And then in December, when we're looking for sit down work to do, they can be doing that at their desks and design a composter. And just a word to that, if you are expected to do garden lessons throughout the year and you have a climate similar to ours, anything that you do with students that's sitting down at the picnic table or sitting down at the garden, examining seeds or dissecting flowers, things like that, you might want to save those until your January, February months so that you're not pulling out your hair trying to find a lesson for those months. And so once I've reviewed and reflected, I'm going to go and begin my sequence, but the review and reflect is an ongoing thing. So maybe I'll have to review skills. Maybe we'll have to, again, talk about the standards before the testing comes up. But this is pretty much how I've sequenced my year based on all of those influencing factors.
And yeah, that design of a calendar works for Callan. My mind works a little bit differently. So we're going to jump into just one other real quick example of how you might lay this out. And this was actually done on some tracing paper. So we started, can click once, please, Whitney. Thank you. We have kind of this directional learning cycle structure is something that we practice here based on the work of Wilderness Awareness School. Beatles curriculum has this learning cycle. A lot of different organizations are kind of following this similar pattern of planning and structuring lessons on an individual scale, and then again for sequencing out larger plans over a longer period of time. That can be really helpful. So if you want to just click again, please, you can see how we layered on the way that plants grow throughout a year. That's kind of, again, the natural cycle that we're working in the context of. And click again, we layer on the kind of energy that happens with an opening of an experience, some focused work time down there at the bottom, gathering and sharing, and that other kind of facilitation styles that we are keeping in mind as we plan a sequence. It can click again, and we're layering on how students might be feeling during these times, and keeping in mind that if we really want to have a high energy activity, we might need to warm them up to it before jumping into something. So this is another again, just layout and way of framing things that make sense in my mind and the practice that we do here at our farm. So we encourage you to take a look at what you're already doing, the calendars and structures that you already use, and try to kind of layer on your garden learning in that same way that you're already working with. You don't have to start from scratch. And we just have one more slide for this section, please. Click one more time. There we go. So this, again, is just a screenshot of our lessons web page. You can go back here after you look through a couple of the outline ideas. You will find these examples. So lesson sequences organized by season, by theme, and by skills acquisition. Each of those are clickable, and they will take you to links of lessons that we thought kind of showed that in a really clear and effective way. And yeah, I think that's it for our section. Again, we're happy to answer some questions at the end and jump into the next folks.
Thanks, Shay. And Callan, thank you so much. All right, we're going to transition to our next scenario. I'd like to introduce two folks that were also in our work group. Erin Bohm is from Here to Be, and is located in Mancos, Colorado, uses she, her pronouns, and works with professional development for garden educators in 15 gardens with 3,200 students. A fun fact about Erin is that she's also a ballet teacher. I'd like to also introduce Erica Krug, uses she, her pronouns, works for Rooted in Madison, Wisconsin, and works with 4 school gardens and 2 youth farms in Madison. Fun fact about Erica is that she used to take a ski lift to work when she managed a snack shack at 9,000 feet in Jackson, Wyoming. All right, take it away, Erin and Erica.
Hello, and welcome to Scenario 2. You have been asked to find highly engaging and effective garden lessons that align to standards and your district pacing guide. So this is a really common and fundamental crossroads to find yourself in. How do I provide a series of lessons that meets the need of my program partner, such as a public school, while staying within my capacity for time and energy put towards lesson planning? So as our working group's title suggests, we suggest that rather than responding to program partner requests by generating your own material, we recommend that you find, improve, and sequence pre-existing lessons. So we're going to highlight a few solutions to this scenario. The document titles in quotations on our slides are referencing the resources found on our lessons webpage. Next slide, please. So let's just circle back for a second. Shay and Callan helped us define the need to establish a North Star or a primary goal. It's shared by your program's capacity and the desire of your program partners. And one of these North Stars you see there is standards. And I'm going to speak to this North Star in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So take a moment to read through this. This can be tempting to try and do it all, but lesson planning around specific North Stars is more effective. I'll give you a second to take a look at this. So backwards design came up a few slides ago. You can use this design tool to organize your thinking around lesson planning in order to identify, select, and adapt lessons that are appropriate to your region and your needs. You work backwards from a primary goal or a North Star. There are three real stages to backwards design. The first is, of course, identify your North Star. What does your program partner want students to be able to know and do as a consequence of your lesson or class? Do they want you to help them meet specific standards? For instance, many schools no longer have a designated health teacher and they struggle to meet health and wellness standards, for example. Or would they like the garden program to help reduce the plate waste in the cafeteria by showing students how to embrace the whole foods that are being introduced on the salad bar? The second step in backwards design is to determine how students will demonstrate what they know and what they can do. One of the great pieces of garden education is students have opportunities to demonstrate that what they know that are different from in the classroom. And then the last step is actually planning learning experiences that actually help students reach this North Star. Next slide, please. So our last slide concluded with 2 instructions. Begin the lesson selection process with conversations about outcomes, and then use a shared language to choose from pre-existing lessons. So we propose that education standards are or can be the shared language used to identify a North Star for each grade level you'll be working with. There are 2 benefits, in my opinion, of garden educators knowing and using using education standards, rather. Number 1, they help you as a garden educator meet your students where they currently are in their studies. And number 2, they encourage you to meet classroom teachers halfway by sharing the language, the same language and the same objectives. We all hope that garden education will be successfully integrated into the daily life of school. So I'd like to propose that there are 3 real important reasons that education standards are critical to this success. The first one is that the product that you're offering is an educational experience and it must meet your client's needs. Teachers and students are your clients. They use this language of the standards amongst themselves to create unity and to precisely describe and compare outcomes. And to truly serve your teachers as clients, learning the language of standards will help you empathize and account for a couple of things. Teachers' realities is that they work in a public school system. They must quickly adapt to the changing mixture of education standards used in their state. This means that your clients' needs will continually change. So keeping up with standards acts like a handrail for remaining in touch and informed of all these changing needs. And the second thing that it helps you to do is understand that teachers put a huge amount of work into planning lessons to ensure they are structured around the current education standards and district pacing guides. So you'll build really strong rapport and buy-in for your program if you can show that you are doing this too. So on this slide here, you can see, oh, back up one. Thanks. You can see some maps showing you where different standards are being enacted. It's not the same in every state. So the third and most important in my way of thinking reason for using these education standards is that if you are able to tell a teacher that you're planning to make some soup in class for third grade. So here's a classic third grade state science standard. Matter exists in different states, such as solids, liquids, and gases, and can change from one state to another by heating and cooling. So if you offer to work this into a garden class where students cook, observe, and taste a vegetable soup, you will find a lot of allies in the third grade. This standard is relatively easy for teachers to meet, but many health and wellness standards are not. However, if you read state standards for health and wellness, you'll find that they're basically a job description for garden educators. I want to point out one more thing on this slide. State standards are regulations describing what students should and can be able to do at the end of each grade level. District pacing guides are actually created by the district. They're supposed to help teachers stay on track and ensure continuity across schools in a district. So some specify the number of days, class periods, or even minutes that teachers are allowed to devote to each topic. So it's really important to know if those are in place. Then there's two others besides state standards. They're Common Core, which is a language, art, and math set of standards that most but not all states have engaged or have adopted. There's a map here showing the states that have adopted CSSS. And then there's next generation science standards. These are K-12 science standards that emphasize ecological literacy and hands-on learning. So they closely align with garden-based learning. There's a map of 20 states that have adopted them as they are in blue, and 24 states that have adopted their own science standards but have been influenced by NGSS. So the question is, what standards are used in your state? And you can find the exact mixture of standards used in your state by Googling my state, common, comma, curriculum standards. Thanks, I'll pass it off to my partner, Erica.
Okay, let's see. Hi there. So as Erin mentioned, one of the most important points we want to make is that you don't need to spend your time, oops, there we go, generating new lessons because there are so many great lessons already out there. We have identified some of these places to find lessons, and they're highlighted on the lessons webpage. Some of these examples include Education Outside, which has 10 units for grades kindergarten through 5th, each with 4 to 8 lessons. These lessons are designed to connect students to nature and engage them in hands-on science in the garden with reference to the next generation science standards. Also, Edible Schoolyard, which is middle school gardening, cooking, and social studies curriculum. Next slide, please. Food Core, which has 96 sequence lessons for grades kindergarten through 5th. These are designed to spark inquiry and a love of healthy food. These are tied to national standards and developed following culturally responsive teaching, place-based learning, and social and emotional learning frameworks. There's also videos of Food Corps service members teaching over 200 of these hands-on lessons. Life Lab is another great place to look for curriculum. They have activity guides and lesson plans, including next generation science in the garden for kindergarten through 2nd grade, the growing classrooms, grades 2 through 6, and sowing the seeds of wonder for pre-K and kindergarten. All of these lessons are designed to cultivate a love of learning, healthy food. All of these lessons are also cross-mapped to national NGSS and Common Core standards. And Whole Kids Foundation, 35 garden enhanced nutrition education lessons designed to engage students in a fun and educational exploration of fruits, vegetables, and healthy eating. These lessons are cross-curricular and support curriculum for pre-K through 5th grade. Next slide, please. When you're looking for lessons or designing your own lesson, it's important to consider the flow and the format of the lesson. One great way to structure your lessons is to utilize the 5 E's. You can look at the 5 E's, which stands for engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate, as your handrail. When you are navigating or trying to find your way, a handrail is a feature or landmark that leads you towards your destination. The 5 E's can help guide you as you look for lessons, or if you need to modify an existing lesson. They are super important because they can help to ensure that you are teaching really engaging lessons. Next slide, please. So this is an example of the 5 E's section of a lesson plan from Food Corps, where 5th graders are learning about plant structures. One of the guiding principles of a 5E lesson plan is that the students have time to engage with each other and learn from one another. For the explain part of this lesson, the students share out about the parts and functions of plants, while one student is actually dressed up as a plant. This is a lot more engaging than having a teacher standing at the front of the room just telling the students this information. If you do need to write your own lesson plan, make sure your template includes a section for the 5 E's. Food Corps has a 5E cheat sheet, which is featured on the on the lesson webpage, and it has a brief overview of each 5E component and helpful tips and actions for each. There are other ways to structure lessons, including flow learning, which we also highlight on the lessons webpage. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate, there are so many great lessons already out there. In addition to the organizations and curriculums that I mentioned, you can also search for lessons on these searchable garden lesson databases, the Big Green Greenhouse, the Collective School Garden Network Curriculum Database, and also Green Schoolyards America. And Erica Curry, back to you.
Thanks, Erica. Thanks, Erin. All right, this is our last scenario we're going to transition to. We have 2 folks that worked on this section quite a bit. George, who is not present with us today, but just want to acknowledge George's work. George works for Climate Corps and Education outside in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we do have Kristen Bailey with us today. Kristen was a co-facilitator of our work group at the Institute, works at Global Gardens in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And a fun fact with Kristen is that she collects vintage glassware, and you'll find her at all estate sales every weekend. And Kristen uses she, her pronouns. All right, take it away, Kristen.
Thanks so much, Erica, for that introduction. And I too want to shout out George. He was so essential in both the web page that we ended up designing around culturally responsive practices and also with this webinar. So thank you, George. So we had scenario number 3, which is if you have a sequence that your program provides for you and you really want to make it more culturally responsive. So this section of the webinar, we thought that it was important to first highlight what is culturally responsive sustaining education, and then move into some specific resources that you as a garden educator, a program director, or any other role in outdoor education can use to make a garden sequence more culturally responsive. And then lastly, we're going to touch on some additional action steps to continue your growth as a culturally responsive educator. So what is Cersei? Cersei is the acronym that I'm going to be using for culturally responsive sustaining education. So if you hear me say Cersei, that's what I'm referring to. So the theory that I'm talking about in the next few slides is pulled from the culturally responsive sustaining education webinar that our working group watched by Danita White. You can find it in the Finding and Sequencing Lessons webpage, and I would highly suggest starting there. It was phenomenal. I want to first also acknowledge that neither George or I are experts on Cersei. We're also learning. So if you have additional resources that you'd like to offer to include on the webpage, there is a link that Whitney mentioned earlier in the webinar to upload resources on our Finding and Sequencing Lessons webpage. So Cersei is a lens, an approach, and a practice to the craft of teaching. It is not just a simple checklist. So it won't be perfect or right every time, but it's crucial as educators that we take on weaving Cersei throughout all of our lessons and our lesson sequences. So there are 4 main pillars or components of Cersei, and they are: 1, centering and valuing students' cultures and identities; 2, using rigorous and relevant curriculum in anti-oppressive teaching practices; 3, building strong, positive relationships between students, families, and school staff; and 4, supporting students to develop the knowledge, skills, and vision to transform the world towards liberation. So this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And as you can see in these 4 pillars, Cersei is inherently not standardized and is really contextual to the what, when, where, and how of you and your students. So this is also a resource that was pulled from Danita's Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education webinar. And we thought that, before we can talk about the how of Cersei, we need to understand what is culture. So while we might think of language, customs, food, crafts, and celebration as the totality of culture, it's so much more. So if you look at the top of the iceberg, there's all those things that I just mentioned, and things that are oftentimes celebrated initially when we talk about culture. But in reality, that deep culture, that bottom part, is really the majority of what our students identify with. So just sharing that surface level can be really harmful. And we have to understand that our culture runs so much deeper than just that surface level definition. And it exists in every action, interaction, and intersection of identity that we experience in our day-to-day life. So it's totally expansive and is an exploration of who our students are and what they can become. And the more we can investigate and get to know what our students' deep experiences of culture have been and are, the more we can be culturally responsive. So the resources that we really focused on our webpage and in our working group were contextual to Pillar 2. So you'll see that Pillar 2 focuses on using rigorous and relevant curriculum in anti-oppressive teaching practices. So I'm going to talk about a couple of resources that we highlighted in just a second that hone in on the what and the how. So for Pillar 2, we wanted to look first at content. So these are some awesome reference banks that have amazing lessons that you can use when trying to be a more culturally responsive, sustaining educator. So it can be really helpful to see examples of culturally responsive lessons. So Soulfire Farm, and Crow Canyon are 2 awesome examples of resources that directly address culture, oppression, and student identity within the context of outdoor education. The next slide. So we know that culturally responsive teaching goes deeper than just the content that we present. And so it's crucial that we examine the how of how we're engaging with our students and the structure of our lessons. So we might ask ourselves, how are students being asked to participate? Who's speaking for most of the lesson? What stories are they internalizing about their experiences in the classroom? So these are just some of the things that you might ask yourself. And here are 4 awesome resources for continuing to ask yourself those questions. Learning for Justice, which was previously named Teaching Tolerance, has a grade-specific list of practices and outcomes that we can use to hold our lessons accountable to teaching in a culturally responsive manner. Los Angeles Unified School District has, I can't sing its praises enough, an extremely practical guide about classroom engagement systems that challenge a conventional classroom and uplift cultural variance and diverse ways of sharing. So lots of different awesome talk moves and ways to think about how you structure every lesson. Youth Outside and Food Corps also provide us with awesome models for understanding CRT and then refining our lessons based on the theory. So again, those 4 things and the 2 databases on the last slide are all included on our webpage. And then lastly, you might not always know, and most often you definitely don't know all of the languages of your students in your classroom. So these are 2 additional great resources for scaffolding to meet the needs of all of your students and families' language identities. So LifeLab provides a scaffolding guide for multilingual learners that is grounded in the 5 E's that you heard about in a previous section. And Rooted provides language resources for Spanish-speaking families. This includes lesson plans, translated take-home materials, and more. And again, if you have additional resources for other language identities that you want to upload on the web page, that would be awesome. Okay, so in our resource, we really honed in on collecting some strong examples of curriculum and teaching practices that are culturally responsive. But that being said, that's only one of the 4 pillars that comprise Cersei, and the other 3 pillars are intentionally not something that can be standardized and therefore require each of us to really do the work of unlearning racism, whiteness, capitalism, and colonialism in the classroom and beyond. So there are so many resources for our personal growth out there as an educator. And this slide is going to highlight just a few ideas of ways you can continue on this lifelong journey. So first, you can intentionally pay attention to and uplift BIPOC voices. So this can be both in your own area and also through social media platforms. So Rodale Institute provides a list of BIPOC environmentalists and farmers to watch. That's also on our webpage. All of this is. Next, you can give if you can. So Soulfire Farm focuses on uprooting racism in the food system. And they, in conjunction with members of the Northeast Farmers of Color Network, have put together this reparations for Black Indigenous farmers map so that you can donate directly. Next, you can read the voices of BIPOC authors. So George and I highlighted on here just 2 amazing resources that are awesome places to start when you're continuing to learn about culturally responsive teaching. But there are so many authors and researchers that have done amazing work with Cersei. So Dr. Leilani Sabzalian, I just read her book, and it focuses on Indigenous children in our public school systems and has incredible recommendations for educators on how to combat colonialism in the classroom and in the curriculum. Her work touches greatly on the cultural iceberg and that resource that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So in culturally responsive teaching and the brain, Zaretta Hammond uses neuroscience research to offer an innovative approach for designing and implementing brain-compatible, culturally responsive instruction. She also has amazing recommendations and self-reflection prompts for educators. And again, these are just 2 of an extensive list of amazing BIPOC authors. And if you know any other books that you want to recommend, please, again, let us know. So lastly, we had an entire group, Working Group C, that was mentioned earlier on strengthening equity and inclusion in garden education. And this stellar group of professionals will be presenting their resources on April 7th at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So if this is something that you're like, yes, I need to know more, I've heard amazing things from Whitney and Tristana about this group, and I can't wait to attend. So I'll leave you with a last guiding question for your professional growth, and that is, who are these leaders in your community, and how can you reach out, connect, and uplift and support the local leadership of BIPOC folks in your community and everywhere? And what are your next action steps to continue your growth and journey from here? So thank you so much for your time today, and we appreciate all of your commitment to students. I'm going to hand it back to Whitney.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And I just want to thank all of our presenters today and close out by just really honoring, close out this part by just really honoring the incredible work that went into this. So I love this quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer. She says, all flourishing is mutual. And I recently, with COVID and here in California, wildfires and just kind of this crazy year that we've had, I recently became familiar with a term that I imagine most of you already knew for a long time, but it's just new to me, mutual aid. And the idea of a mutual aid network is different from just kind of philanthropy where one person is giving and one person is receiving. Mutual aid is what it sounds like. It's reciprocal. It's everyone helping each other for the betterment of all. And that's really what I see happening here. And I feel so honored and inspired to be part of this group that SGSOs can say, hey, I developed a lesson sequence and I can share it with people across the country and then they can use it and learn from it. And then another one says, hey, and I have a tool for making lessons more culturally responsive and here it is. And together, we're just all growing stronger. And so I'm so grateful to this working group and also all of the SGSOs and individuals who contributed resources to this webpage so that we can all support each other in this way. So thank you to the working group and thank you to everyone who's here for learning together. Just so glad to have you here. And so now we're going to pivot to time for Q&A if there are questions. And before we do, let me just show you one last thing and I almost forgot. Hang on, next slide. Oh, of course it won't go forward for me. There we go. If you are hopping off before the Q&A, I just want to highlight that there is this post-webinar survey. We would really appreciate your feedback. So if you could just go to that when you hop, right as you're hopping off. I think that Tristana can put it into the chat right now. That would be great. We'd love your feedback. We're always looking for how to improve these. And now for anyone who's interested in the Q&A, you're welcome to hop off now, but if you'd like to stay on, we'd love to take some time to answer questions you have. And if we have any time left after that, give a little tour of the website itself. So I'll stop screen sharing and Tristana, I'll turn it over to you for Q&A.
Great. We haven't gotten a ton of questions so far. So if you had any questions come up, please do put them into the Q&A section, please. But we'll start with one. When thinking about themes, has anyone used kind of building safe community space as a part of garden education? And if so, how? So building safe community space is a part of garden education. And if so, how? And if any panelists want to answer, you can show your video and unmute yourself.
I wonder for this part, Tristana, if it makes sense for all of the panelists to turn on video so we can see each other.
Great.
Thanks. Did somebody here on the panelist team want to jump in there on creating safe spaces?
I can. One of the strategies that I used when I was a garden coordinator was to really intentionally get to know all the neighbors who live very close to the garden itself, whoever they are, and be sure that they know that there's a school garden that is also public space for them to come and sit, that they are welcome, and that eventually there was a series of community weeding days to make sure people felt like they could come and learn what's safe to take out and what's not. And then they were set up for future individual engagement. And so it was really just sort of like starting really close to the garden and in little concentric circles, interacting with neighbors.
I can share something that I heard from Rebecca, Rebecca Lemos Otero formerly worked at City Blossoms, and now she's an independent consultant. She's actually part of Working Group C. And something that she shared with us, I think at the last in-person institute, was when starting a garden at a new school, she would often kind of survey the children and their families about what crops are important in your family, and then use that to build the planting plan. And that allowed her to kind of ensure that a lot of crops that are culturally relevant to the families that are represented there in that garden felt kind of like, oh, there's something familiar to me, or there's something. And she said that really helped to get a lot of community buy-in for the garden and create a feeling of safety, especially for, I think, more recent immigrants who are, here in their first year, for example, to see those kind of familiar crops from home was essential kind of ingredient there.
Whitney, building on what you said, in our garden, all of our signs for the identifying crops are in English and in Spanish. And I've also heard it recommended to do a welcome sign, which we haven't done in our garden, but a welcome sign in as many of the languages that you know of, saying welcome to the garden, that represent the languages of the communities that the garden serves.
When I think of safe and thinking about community, I was thinking about social emotional learning and just thinking about safety with all of the context, particularly in last year and a lot of the trauma that communities have faced. And I was thinking about creating a safe emotional space for the community, and some of the ways to do that I've seen have been successful are around creating agreements for how the garden is used and doing that in a really collaborative way where the community and students are involved in thinking about how the space can be used and feel safe for people. So that's a suggestion.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll go on to the next one. Is there a good resource that either of you could recommend for skills at various age levels? When can students, write sentences versus just words versus a full description, and when should you expect pictures only? So kind of a good resource for skills at various age levels.
Do we know more about the skills that the person's asking? Is it garden skills or is it English language skills?
Tristana, were those examples you gave about writing sentences in the question itself, or were you adding them? Okay.
Yes,
so,
those were, yes, everything I shared was what was asked in the question.
Awesome. I can just jump in to start on this one that for academic skills, I actually really rely on the standards to let me know what's developmentally appropriate. So even if the school isn't saying I have to teach to the standards, or even if there's not pressure there, the standards are also a great reference to say, like, so when are kids doing measurement and when are they getting fractions, and or in this case, when are they writing full sentences? When are they expected to write their name? And just by referencing the standards, I can see what would be age appropriate that then I might incorporate into my garden lessons. So that's usually where I start with academic skills. And I will say those standards are based on research about what students are able to do at different ages. So, so it's not arbitrary.
Great, thank you. And the question asker did clarify with academic skills, so thank you. That was great.
Okay, I was just going to hop in. If in fact they're asking about more garden skills in terms of tools and what they could be expected to do, the other cue there is their classroom tools, right? So if they're using small rounded scissors, you can use those to harvest lettuce. If they're using very short rulers, use the same ones in the garden and you'll know that you're about where they're at.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have anything to share? Otherwise, I'll go into the next question. Awesome. In general, what are some of the barriers that prevent kids from participating in gardens in general and as a learning component? So what are some of the barriers that you've seen?
I would like to jump in this because all kids love to be in the garden. And I think the biggest barrier is the grownups in their life, not that they don't want them in the garden, but just time constraints or teachers maybe not knowing how to interact in the garden, not knowing how to deliver lessons. In my experience anyway, nearly all of the children who go in the garden want to be there. So it's us finding a way to get them there.
Great, any other barriers?
I've had students who are not allowed to get dirty. Their parents are very serious about this. And so it's like a public service kind of announcement, garden class is coming up. Please don't wear your white pants or your brand new, very expensive sneakers, reiterating that through the classroom teacher, whatever you can do. It's really mostly about clothing, seems like, after a certain age. And then like kneeling pads, inexpensive camping foam pads cut into small sections for bums or knees makes a huge difference when it comes to that type of barrier.
Great, thank you. How about experience using social justice themes in your garden lessons? This particular question asker wants to create a 6-week after-school gardening series where students get involved with social justice topics, specifically food access and racial health disparities. So do any of you have experience using social justice themes in your gardening lessons?
can speak to that a little bit. We're working to develop a food systems exploration right now. And one thing we've found helpful is kind of taking a layered approach, starting with a personal reflections on what students' experiences with food have been, their own kind of comfort and understanding in that, and then asking them to sort of start expanding their thinking. Okay, well, who am I connected to who has informed this thought? What practices am I doing at home, or have I been taught by my immediate family and friends? And then, okay, well, what is the kind of broader situation that culture lies in? Who else is informing this? And kind of that almost like a targeted expanding circles approach to thinking, rather than jumping right into these really big concepts, breaking it down and starting from a personal experience level, and then inviting them to kind of pursue pathways of connection that they're finding to be true for themselves, rather than kind of telling them this is what it is and here's why. More like, well, what do you notice, and where are those questions coming from, and where does that lead you next? And really it has come down to a lot of questioning, rather than offering answers, just being open and asking folks to reflect. And then getting, for this particular project we're working on, interviewing some local leaders in food systems work and food access work about their experiences, and also keeping those interviews very personal as well. Like, what inspired you to do the work that you are now doing to support your communities? One example there.
So I wanted to add, Shay, the work that you're doing around that sounds amazing. And also the person who wrote the question, that's incredible. And even if you don't have a program specifically for social justice, I feel like being in the garden, if you're open to opportunities, there are opportunities to present those things. And one example I'll share is all children refer, like most of the children that I work with refer to animals as he. You know, the bugs are all he, the bird is he. And I make a point of saying she. Now I'm going to start using they, and just talking about why, because then they'll ask me, why did you assume it was a she? And then why did you assume it was a he? And we get this conversation, just very naturally, very organically around that. Also around, different size and color vegetables that come out of the ground. You can use some pretty real authentic situations in the garden to lead other discussions.
Great, thank you both. That was wonderful. Let's see, my thing just moved. Do you have any resources on, trauma-based or trauma-informed curriculum and how to work with students that have experienced trauma?
I'll just highlight, there is a webinar on this topic at sgsonetwork.org/webinars. It's archived, but there was a great webinar on trauma-informed garden education through this network, maybe a year ago, 9 months ago, something. And there are a lot of resources on gardens as restorative environments, and a couple of good key search terms for that kind of topic are horticultural therapy or restorative environments. If you're looking for specific physical design ideas, like seating areas, anyway, those are a couple of great resources for that.
Great, thank you, Whitney. Yeah, I was remembering that webinar as well. I'm really glad you said that. Great. For our panelists, what kind of rules do you consider applying strictly while doing garden lessons? And how do you balance between letting the students explore themselves and kind of between directing them to stay on theme?
Whitney, the 4 Ps comes to mind. Do you want to share that one?
Sure, I'd be happy to. When we talk about outdoor classroom management, I think we might also have a webinar on that I'm not sure. John, you put in the chat what I'm thinking of, if you know what I'm talking about. But when we talk about outdoor classroom management, we often talk about the 4 Ps. And so parameters, establishing sort of the behavior expectations at the outset together with your students and making sure everybody is on board with, specific parameters like staying on the pathways and that kind of thing. Participation, so setting up activities so that everybody has something to do the whole time. So for example, rather than one kid watering with a hose while 28 kids wait in line, every kid has their yogurt container and they're running around the garden, pouring a little water and then going and refilling it, that kind of thing. Let's see, what else are they? Parameters, participation, perceptions, setting up the garden to maximize the idea that it's a classroom. And so really kind of establishing that at the outset. And I'm rusty. Erica, do you remember the fourth P? Oh, personal relationships. Just building in time to every lesson and every time we're in the garden to help the students both connect with you as the educator and with each other. So building that right into your lessons, hey, before we start, turn to your neighbor and tell them what you did this weekend, or, hey, as you're coming into the garden, pre-COVID, high fives on the way into the garden, anything to build those personal relationships. We consider that kind of just foundational 4 Ps for managing groups outdoors. And I'll just say that I think when asking like, what are you strict about and what are you loose about? I'm really strict about anything related to safety. So whenever we're like chopping with knives or digging with shovels, I'm like, there are no warnings, like if this doesn't work out, if you're playing with your tools in a way that's unsafe, then you're not going to use the tool until next time. And so I'm really strict about that stuff, but I am not really at all strict about things like distractions. So if I'm teaching about erosion and a butterfly starts flying over and the kids are like, butterfly, I'm like, butterfly, we kind of go with that. We call those teachable moments. So really honoring that part of garden teaching, that part of it is to let the gopher distract you and take that moment because that might be the first time the kid's ever seen something like that.
And I just dropped a really great handout with an overview of the 4 Ps in the garden that Food Corps developed with Whitney in the chat. People can reference.
I found too that having open-ended tasks is always useful, like go find, something this color or go find something larger than the stick. Or also having time at the beginning of a garden lesson for children to explore and look for something new. We sometimes do like go find something that you haven't seen in the garden that's new from yesterday. And that can help with management and that kids have gotten a chance to wander around and maybe get their wiggles out a little bit before you bring them back.
I've used a similar strategy where I have students find their special spot. They choose a special spot in the garden that they return to each time. And especially in a classroom where there's a lot of wiggles and behavior issues in the past, by starting out the garden class by having them go to their special spot and bring back an observation from it, something that's awesome and something that needs doing. And then those observations about things that need doing, make it up onto the whiteboard, like real garden tasks that everybody acknowledges is a real thing, so that they get time alone in their special spot, but they're also seeing that that actually is how gardens run, is by observation on their own, however they want to do it, before they enter into the structured part of this lesson.
These are all amazing suggestions and thoughts. Thank you so much. We have another question about resources for kind of game-like activities that are used in the garden or elsewhere that cover kind of broader themes of sustainability education. So kind of game-like activities and kind of broader themes of sustainability education. Do you have any suggestions for resources, either from panelists, or I'm also seeing a lot of great resources shared in the chat too. So if any of our attendees have resources for that. Cool. Well, it sounds like something that we can all look up and Google.
I'll just share. I'll put something in the chat. Shelburne Farms is a wonderful resource for sustainability education, and I'll put a bunch of resources from Shelburne Farms in the chat. But I'm looking for them right now, so I'll put them in there.
We also we've mentioned so many great ones already, but the one that came to mind in my work in a Waldorf school is Wild Math. So if anyone's specifically looking at math, that's math in the outdoors.
Just pointing out in the chat, I see Teresa has shared a few things by John Young as well. The Coyotes Guide is what has informed our learning cycle, and they also have a bunch of games in there that are very fun and have a kind of environmental learning built into their structure.
Great, thank you. So another question is, does anyone have any experience linking garden lessons to kind of the school feeding program, kind of the lunch program?
Just off the bat, I would recommend checking out the Farm to School network. A lot of folks working on there, both from the schools themselves, farmers and food producers and educators all working together to build those connections. And there's a lot of resources on their website. Again, farmtoschoolnetwork.org, I think.
Yeah, I think food service directors should be on your team, you know, get to know them, find out who they are, and find out how the cafeteria works and how the cafeteria is connected to those food insecurity issues, and then how they solve them. And then that relationship, in my experience, has been very fruitful with food service directors.
Tristana, do you feel free to say no if this wouldn't be relevant, but you could share about the Garden to Cafeteria Toolkit, and it's linked to from Promising Practices.
Yes, thank you for that. Whole Kids Foundation developed with Slow Food USA, the Garden to Cafeteria Toolkit, which is about helping to set up these standards and procedures so that students can harvest the produce in their garden and work with the school food services to then serve the produce on the lunch line. So, you know, very real life, real world lesson right there. You know, examples of how to do it, other districts that have done it successfully, kind of sample protocols, but that's all housed on Whole Kids Foundation's website, and it sounds like also on the Promising Practices webpage. Perfect. Thanks for that, Whitney.
Mm-hmm.
I'll share that Food Corps website. I just dropped a link, has a taste test guide, and leading taste tests in cafeterias is a wonderful way to bridge the connection, similar to what Tristana was saying. And the taste test guide on the link I just shared is an overview around different ideas for leading taste tests, which can be connected to garden-based education. And then a really wonderful touch point to then integrate conversations and inform what is being served on the cafeteria as well, and build those connections with food service professionals.
A taste testing idea can be really helpful if you don't quite have a food service team who's ready to bring garden stuff into the cafeteria and manage that safely. And, you know, cleanliness can be a really big concern. But if you frame it as a taste test, you can get away with kind of making those connections a little more.
Great. Awesome. Well, I'll close out by, we had a very, very kind question asker wondering if any of you are available for paid consulting opportunities because your skill is just so great. So if anyone is available, you can raise your hand. We've got some folks who can help support you even further. So I think that's all of the questions that we received, and we're about at time. We've got about a minute left. So just wanted to close out and say thank you so much to all the members of the working group that worked on all of these resources, to our amazing facilitators, Erica, Kristen, and Whitney, and then to all of the panelists today who gave their time today to walk through these amazing resources, specifically on lessons and lesson sequencing. Thank you so much, and thanks for joining us. We'll hope you'll join us for the other Promising Practice series in our future webinars. And we also hope that you'll let us know how the webinar was in the survey that's about to pop up on your screen. Great. Have a good rest of your day.